As of August of 2025, the Trump administration has ordered the use of military force against Mexican drug cartels on Mexican soil, a move that was swiftly condemned by Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. How or even if this order will be carried out remains uncertain, but calls for U.S. military intervention in Mexico are not new. In June 2014, during an interview with the Tea Party affiliated group, Republican congressional candidate Mark Walker of North Carolina stated his support for using the U.S. military to combat Mexican drug cartels on Mexican soil. When asked in a follow up interview whether he had any qualms about potentially going to war with Mexico, he responded, "Well, we did it before, and if we need to do it again, I don't have qualms about it." The remark drew applause from the audience, but Walker later walked back his statement, framing it as more of an attention grabbing comment than a serious policy proposal supported by himself, his campaign, or the broader Republican establishment at the time. Indeed, in 2014, the idea of direct American military intervention in Mexico was far from mainstream, given the already extensive cooperation between the two nations. That cooperation had taken several forms. In 2007, the United States, Mexico, and several Central American countries signed the Merida Initiative, also known as Plan Mexico, a security partnership aimed at fighting organized crime through the strengthening of law enforcement capacity, modernizing judicial systems, and providing targeted training. Under the initiative, the United States supplied funding, equipment, and other material support to aid Mexico's law enforcement and military in their efforts against the cartels. For example, training has been a key area of collaboration. Since the start of Mexico's drug war in 2006, U.S. law enforcement and military personnel have traveled to Mexico to provide hands-on instruction. An October 2011 NPR report highlighted this cooperation, quoting a Mexican Marine corporal who explained that American forces shared valuable expertise drawn from their experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2012, Mexico took another step in deepening its defense ties with the United States by participating for the first time in RIMPAC, the world's largest maritime warfare exercise hosted every 2 years by the U.S. Navy. Mexico has then taken part in every RIMPAC operation since. Given this strong and sustained partnership, the notion of the United States putting combat troops into Mexico was never seriously considered at the time. In cases such as Walker's 2014 comments, such proposals were generally understood as rhetorical bravado, attention-grabbing sound bites with no practical policy basis, rendered unnecessary by the already robust security cooperation between the two countries. And despite Mr. Walker's statements, Mexico and the United States maintained strong security cooperation throughout the early 2000s and into the 2010s. This partnership intensified after 2006 when newly elected President Felipe Calderon declared in his inaugural speech that his administration would confront Mexico's crime challenges head on. Although Calderon did not mention the cartels by name, he announced a comprehensive security program aimed at improving policing and restoring public safety. He promised to battle against criminals from the front lines, acknowledging the heavy financial and human cost that this would entail. Days later, he launched Operación Conjunta Michoacán, deploying 6,500 soldiers and police to his home state, marking the official start of the Mexican drug war. At first glance, the administration appeared to act decisively. Calderon framed the operations as a fight to protect Mexicans from decades of organized crime, but politically, they also served to legitimize his presidency amid allegations of electoral irregularities. Critics argue that these military deployments painted him as a wartime president, rallying against a common enemy, diverting attention from doubts about his mandate. However, reports of collusion soon emerged. Calderon's administration was accused of targeting rival cartels such as the Zetas, Beltran Leyva, and Gulf cartel, while giving the Sinaloa cartel preferential treatment. A 2010 NPR report quotes former federal police officer Luis Arturo Perez Guzman, who claimed that the government actively protected the Sinaloa cartel. Interviews with law enforcement officials and organized crime experts suggested the cartel used bribes to shield its leader, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, from capture. In 2019, Calderon's former Secretary of Public Safety, Genaro Garcia Luna, was arrested in Texas on charges of taking bribes from the Sinaloa cartel. Testimony during his trial included former cartel associates who detailed instances of protection for cartel leaders, intelligence on rivals, and assistance with drug shipments in exchange for said bribes. The Peña Nieto administration faced similar accusations. Beyond the Odebrecht bribery scandal, testimony in the El Chapo case claimed that Peña Nieto accepted $100 million from the Sinaloa cartel in exchange for reduced law enforcement pressure, protection for key leaders, and less interference in trafficking routes. Although these claims were presented under oath, they remain allegations and have not been legally proven. These cases reveal a paradox. While Mexico launched its costly war on drugs, administrations simultaneously colluded with organized crime. They leveraged bribes and concessions to help entrench select cartels. And at the same time, Mexico cooperated with the United States through initiatives such as the Merida Initiative, through cross-national military training programs, and through intelligence sharing. In some cases, U.S. agencies were implicated in similar controversies. A January 2014 report by El Universal described alleged collusion between the DEA and the Department of Justice with the Sinaloa cartel. And then there was the 2009 to 2011 Fast and Furious operation, which allowed firearms to reach cartels in the hope of tracking them to leadership, a plan that largely failed, with weapons still appearing at Mexican crime scenes to this day. When Morena came to power in 2018, President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, shifted strategy. Rather than focusing primarily on warfare, his administration targeted the social roots of crime. Programs expanded the minimum wage, created pensions for seniors, implemented scholarships, and provided welfare for people with permanent disabilities. The goal being that these programs would offer alternatives to cartel recruitment and thus aid in crime reduction. While homicide rates declined only modestly, these initiatives lifted over 5 million Mexicans out of poverty. Recognizing that social programs alone were insufficient, AMLO later adjusted security policy. After setbacks like the First Battle of Culiacan, what's known as the Culiacanazo, the administration increased National Guard recruitment and placed major public works projects under military oversight. These measures helped to stabilize homicide rates while maintaining modest reductions in cartel recruitment. Throughout his tenure, AMLO emphasized the principle of cooperation with the United States, but without submission, asserting that Mexico would combat organized crime jointly while preserving sovereignty. This stance reflected a broader approach. While willing to work with the U.S. on matters of mutual interest, AMLO was also prepared to resist foreign influence, especially when it conflicted with Mexico's national priorities, signaling a new era of assertive Mexican policy both at home and abroad. AMLO's approach to Mexico-U.S. cooperation heavily emphasized sovereignty and reducing foreign influence. Reflecting the stance, his administration reformed Mexico's national security laws, significantly curtailing the freedom of foreign agents, particularly the DEA. Under the new framework, agents were stripped of diplomatic immunity, required to share all intelligence with Mexican authorities, and they were obligated to report all meetings with Mexican officials to the federal government. Sanctions for noncompliance included visa revocation and potential prosecution under Mexican law. Now, despite pushback from Washington, AMLO defended the measures as necessary to prevent what he framed as foreign overreach into Mexico's internal security affairs. His message was clear. Mexico would continue to cooperate with the United States, sharing intelligence, coordinating cross-national training missions, and aligning on enforcement priorities, but cooperation would take place without submission. This sovereignty-first philosophy extended beyond security cooperation. In April 2023, AMLO announced the government's plans to purchase 13 power plants from the Spanish-owned energy giant Iberdrola, increasing the Federal Electricity Commission's, the CFE's, market share from 40% to 56%. He framed the acquisition as a new nationalization of Mexico's energy sector, aimed at reversing the loss of control brought about by Enrique Peña Nieto's 2013 energy reforms. For AMLO, the deal was both symbolic and practical. It projected nationalist strength while promising greater protection against global energy volatility, like the price spikes Europe experienced from 2021 to 2022. However, the purchase also deepened tensions with Mexico's trade partners. The United States and Canada accused Mexico of undermining private and foreign firms by prioritizing state-generated electricity on the national grid, even when privately produced power was cleaner and cheaper. Both governments threatened legal action under the USMCA, arguing that Mexico's energy reforms violated investor protections and unfairly rewrote the terms of existing contracts. AMLO dismissed these complaints as pressure tactics, casting the dispute as yet another example of Mexico asserting its sovereignty in the face of foreign demands. The Iberdrola deal was only one front in AMLO's campaign to reclaim control over Mexico's strategic industries. That same year, his government also moved against a private firm, seizing a privately owned port facility and declaring lithium as a strategic mineral reserved for state control. Together, these moves underscored how AMLO's sovereignty-first approach was not confined to energy, but part of a broader economic and political vision that repeatedly put Mexico at odds with its allies. In 2018, the Canadian company Bacanora Lithium confirmed the presence of a major lithium deposit in Sonora, northern Mexico. Further studies determined that it was among one of the largest deposits of lithium in the world, with reserves estimated at 243.8 million tons. Almost immediately, foreign firms such as Bacanora Lithium and China's Ganfeng Lithium began positioning themselves to exploit the resource. Initially, the Lopez Obrador administration, AMLO's administration, was slow to react, focused instead on its broader electricity reforms under the banner of a new nationalization. Still, from the outset, the administration had signaled its intent to reassert state control over strategic sectors such as oil, energy, and now lithium, arguing that these resources were too vital to be left vulnerable to foreign interests. By 2021, however, lithium demand surged worldwide with the rapid expansion of electric vehicle production, and it became clear that Mexico risked falling behind. The alarm grew louder as US officials began framing lithium as a critical mineral essential for American supply chains, openly discussing the need to secure access to it. For Mexico, this was clear. It was a signal of looming foreign pressure to open its reserves to outside exploitation. In anticipation, AMLO's government moved decisively, and in April of 2022, it signed a law nationalizing lithium, declaring it as a strategic mineral whose exploitation would be reserved exclusively for the Mexican state. This reform also created Litiomex, or Litio-MX, a state-owned company tasked with overseeing the exploration and development of Mexico's lithium wealth. Now, the United States and Canada both signaled their disapproval of Mexico's sovereignty-first policies. Canada responded by reimposing visa requirements for Mexican travelers, which had previously been lifted under Justin Trudeau, although Ottawa framed this decision as a response to rising asylum claims from Mexico, which broader data shows that since around 2018, more Mexicans have actually been returning to the homeland than leaving it, meaning he's full of shit. Meanwhile, in the United States, a far more hostile response was beginning to take shape, one emerging from within the Republican Party. By 2023, reports from Politico, Rolling Stone, and Semaphore documented that high-level members of the GOP, including Senate and House representatives, were seriously considering direct military action in Mexico. This was not mere rhetorical saber-rattling, but a calculated proposal from MAGA-aligned think tanks, such as the so-called Center for Renewing America. Their white paper presented to former President Trump recommended unilateral strikes into Mexican territory. While the document suggested requesting cooperation from Mexico, they also emphasized that it is vital that Mexico not be led to believe that they have the veto power to prevent US from taking actions necessary to secure its borders and people. In other words, American forces could act on Mexican soil with or without consent, a clear violation of Mexican sovereignty. The US government officially justified these proposals by citing the threat posed by Mexican drug cartels, including the trafficking of fentanyl and the exploitation of migrants. These claims are not false. Mexico's cartels have long been responsible for smuggling drugs into the United States, engaging in human trafficking, and spilling violence across the border. Yet it is striking that this sense of urgency coincided with Mexico's discovery of vast lithium reserves in Sonora. For decades, the same cartel threats existed, but it was only when lithium became strategically important to American supply chains that calls for intervention escalated. The US argument that Mexico has failed to control cartels also ignores decades of complicating factors, including American involvement. Operations like the ATF's Fast and Furious allowed cartels such as Sinaloa to access firearms that often outmatched Mexican law enforcement. Meanwhile, the DEA and the DOJ's collusion with the Sinaloa cartel let hundreds of millions of dollars worth of drugs flow into the United States, strengthening the same criminal networks that Mexico has been fighting for 20 years. Taken together, these facts suggest that the motivation for U.S. pressure is less about national security, border security, or public health, and more about economic interests. Securing control over Mexico's lithium reserves and other critical minerals appears to be a driving factor, with cartel-related concerns serving as a convenient justification. The Mexican drug cartels are now serving the role that communists once played during the U.S. interventions in Latin America under Operation Condor, in the same way that communism was once used as a boogeyman to justify military actions in Guatemala, Chile, Nicaragua, El Salvador. The cartels are now being portrayed as a pretext for intervention in Mexico, and the parallels are striking, especially considering America's track record of over 50 military interventions in the region. These operations often took the form of regime change wars designed to topple democratically elected governments or US-backed coups in favor of far-right authoritarian regimes, all in the name of securing American economic interests. And today, we are seeing the same playbook applied to Mexico. The country now has a government willing to resist U.S. overreach, protect its sovereignty, and prioritize its own interests through nationalizations, restrictions on the operational scope of American law enforcement agencies in the country, and a focus on domestic social spending rather than projects that favor U.S. priorities. Mexico has signaled that for the first time in decades, its people come first. In response, the United States, under Republican leadership, has created a new boogeyman in an attempt to either pressure Mexico into compliance or, failing that, to enforce compliance by force. What the Republican Party, or at least those members actively seeking conflict, seem to have forgotten is that military interventions in sovereign countries carry serious consequences. Past interventions in Latin America have often generated instability, fueling gang violence, insurgencies, and poverty. These conditions, in turn, allowed criminal organizations like MS-13 and larger organized crime movements to expand, creating a vicious feedback loop of violence and instability. Such conditions also triggered mass migration waves toward the very country responsible for that instability. American interventions in the region were often undertaken without the consent of local populations, meaning that these operations lacked legitimacy and sparked resistance. This resistance frequently extended to governments installed or supported by the US, leaving them unable or unwilling to implement meaningful reforms that could reduce instability. Instead, these governments often prioritized American interests over the welfare of their own citizens. The resulting combination of illegitimacy, lack of reform, and local opposition perpetuated instability, creating an environment where revolutionary action was seen as necessary to regain sovereignty. And there is no reason to believe that US intervention in Mexico would produce a different outcome. A direct US military strike into Mexico would carry immediate and severe consequences. The cartels, though increasingly militarized, remain irregular forces embedded within civilian populations. This proximity means that any military intervention is almost certainly to result in significant civilian casualties. Even limited civilian losses would have multiple ripple effects, including increased refugee migration to neighboring countries, particularly the United States. And another likely consequence would be a surge of nationalistic fervor, driving recruitment into the Mexican armed forces and local self-defense militias. Paradoxically, this would also likely boost cartel recruitment. Some Mexicans would likely come to view cartel retaliation as heroic resistance to foreign intervention, elevating certain criminal organizations into symbols of opposition to American imperialism. Such outcomes would effectively undo any progress achieved by either government in the fight against organized crime. Although the Mexican military boasts the third largest active duty force in the Americas, it lacks the capacity to hold off a superior US force indefinitely. Urban environments along the border might initially slow American advances and produce heavy casualties, but large population centers would eventually fall to superior firepower. Rural mountainous regions, dense forests and jungles would favor asymmetric tactics, yet Mexico would likely still lose a conventional war within roughly a month. Defeat in conventional terms, however, would not end the conflict. Mexican forces would shift to guerrilla warfare, aiming to exhaust US resources and erode political credibility. History supports this expectation. During the Second French intervention in Mexico, Mexican forces demonstrated that strong nationalistic motivation could sustain resistance against technologically superior armies. Lessons from Vietnam and Afghanistan further highlight that asymmetric conflicts often produce limited long-term gains, rarely justifying the human or financial cost. Historical precedent and practical realities converge to this one conclusion. A US military intervention in Mexico would almost certainly destabilize the region. It would empower nationalist and criminal networks, and it would fail to resolve the challenges that it purports to address. Cooperation, respect for sovereignty, and locally driven government reforms, not unilateral strikes, remain the only viable path toward meaningful, lasting solutions in Mexico's fight against organized crime. If I am wrong about Republican threats of war actually being about Mexican resources and getting Mexico to fall in line, if this is really about wanting to end the threat that cartels pose, then there is an actual viable path that the United States can take aside from unilateral strikes within Mexican territory. For one, the United States can continue its aid to Mexico. Material aid, military, law enforcement training, intelligence sharing, judicial cooperation through the extradition of cartel leadership. These are all things that the United States and Mexico have already been doing and has been working. Material aid has allowed the Mexican armed forces to modernize and meet the threat of a more militarized organized crime organization. Joint training exercises paired with intelligence sharing has actively made Mexican forces, both military and law enforcement, significantly more effective at combating the cartels. Finally, extradition to the United States has been effective in removing the threat posed by cartel leaders by placing them in high security prisons in the United States. These points of cooperation have yielded results, even if modest, and it would be best to continue. If the United States wants to make further progress, it could pick up in the areas where it has been falling behind for years, namely the flow of guns from the United States into Mexico. The United States could implement federal universal background check laws. It could impose federal firearm laws, which would force all 80% lower weapons to be serialized and registered, regardless of whether or not they are for personal use or not. The United States could also re-implement an assault weapons ban, which, for example, they allowed to expire in 2004, even if they only impose it temporarily, just to ease the flow of high-powered weapons from the United States to Mexico. These are examples of actual security policies. The destabilizing effects that intervention would have would only worsen issues of national security for both the United States and Mexico. But we all know what this is really about. Mexico's resources, Mexico's sovereignty, and the audacity of Mexico to finally dare to put itself first after decades of submission. Even when dressed up as security concerns, calls for US intervention are nothing but a recycled imperial fantasy. They're reckless, they're counterproductive, and they're an insult to our dignity as a people. Washington already knows what its failed war on drugs has created. Cartels fattened by US demand and armed by US weapons. To answer this with foreign boots and bombs would not solve Mexico's problems. It would repeat the same disasters that the United States has left across the globe, where every intervention has birthed only chaos, corruption, and suffering. Mexico is not a failed state, nor is it incapable of meeting its own challenges. On the contrary, the progress we have made, especially under Morena, proves that we are charting our own course. What Mexico needs is not occupation, but respect. True cooperation rooted in equality, not domination. And the accountability that is truly required lies in the United States itself, to confront its appetite for drugs, its flow of guns, and its corruption that feeds cartels. Mexico's destiny must be written by Mexicans alone. No empire has the right to dictate our future. US intervention would not bring peace. It would desecrate our sovereignty and tear apart the nation. What is needed instead is investment in our people, reforms led by our own government, and solidarity among Mexicans. Only then can we confront our enemies, not as a playground for a foreign power, but as a sovereign nation rising to defend its dignity, its future, and its rightful place in history.